As I began to reflect on my literacy lesson, I found myself not only thinking about my strengths teaching the lesson, but also my weaknesses when teaching the lesson. I also thought about different components that I used from our discussions in our literacy methods class. First and foremost, in terms of my weaknesses, I think that I have a certain weakness of spoon feeding, which is how my pen mentor kind of referred to it. In her notes, something that she outlined was that there were these few very, very small instances where I inadvertently spoon-fed certain parts of the discussion. I wasn't allowing enough waiting time, which was something that we discussed a lot in class. I was a little impatient in this one instance, and right as I said something, it turned out that the student who was starting to share his ideas about the poem, I believe it was the Two Boys Pasternak poem, he was about to say what I was going to say. So when I began to think about what I was going to write about and discuss in my term 3 reflection, I began to think about the ways in which I could have used waiting time more. And in the future, when I'm not only teaching literacy lessons, but when I'm teaching other lessons, I want to consider the importance of wait time more. And another weakness I would say that I had was not giving the students enough time to really let the material sink in. I think in terms of the pace of the lesson, one thing I would have wanted to do if I could do it over again was to maybe slow down the pace a little bit, because I remember that day when I taught the lesson, we were actually ahead in terms of time. So there really didn't need to be a rush, but I think for some reason I felt that the lesson was taking too long, so that there wasn't as smooth of a transition into the second part of the lesson, the actual writing part, as there should have been. So another weakness that I think I had specifically in this lesson was not being mindful of how smooth that transition needs to be. With that said, though, I do think that I had certain strengths within the lesson. Something that I felt went really well was a routine that I established beyond the routine that we used of having the students write in their own words. Another routine that I established in the lesson was during the third part of the lesson when they were sharing the poems that they wrote. The routine that I wanted them to follow was kind of a coffee house style of sharing poetry, where after each person shares their poem, they snap like this. So initially, I was the first to share my poem. That was a conscious choice. I not only wanted to introduce them to the routine of snapping their fingers, but I also wanted to set the stage and tone for the rest of the discussion. So I opened by sharing my poem with them, which was a poem that I actually wrote about my grandmother. Within the group, there were 2 students of the 4 students who wrote about their grandparents. One student wrote about his grandmother who had instantly died only a couple of days before the lesson, and another student wrote a very heartfelt poem to her grandmother who also passed away. Another strength that I think I had in this lesson, something I think that really went well, was the actual discussion itself. And my guiding question to term 3 had to do with establishing a difference between a pedagogy of questioning, more of a Socratic method, versus explicit teaching. And especially in this literacy lesson, I wanted to experiment more with using questioning. And I think in terms of the discussion part of my lesson, that was a part of the lesson in which I felt that the questioning worked really, really well. I was really, really astonished by some of the responses by one of the students. My pen mentor, in her notes, something that she mentioned was this one student who when he was talking about the Boris Pasternak poem written by Anna Akhmatova, one thing that he said was that there seemed to be a reference to the Holy Spirit, and he began to pick out examples from the text where he felt that the poem was referencing the Holy Spirit. There were other comments during the discussion that I think really helped move the discussion along. My classroom mentor in the very beginning of the school year had me watch DVDs by Margaret Atwell, and something that she does in her videos and her discussions during her reader and writer workshop is that she really does use questions to guide the discussion, but another thing that she does is she lets the students almost guide the discussion, and she listens as each one of them connects to a statement that was previously made by another student, and then she will interject and respond to their comments, and at the same time may also move the discussion in another direction. So when I was teaching this lesson, another strength that I think that I had was just managing the flow of the conversation, and I was really, really excited to see how all the students were not only commenting on the material, but their comments really seemed to be connecting with each other. If one student said something, another student would then maybe reference what that student just said and then add something more to the discussion. So it was a really rich discussion. In terms of the routine that my partner Jill and I wanted to use in our lesson, I think that also was something that went really well, and it was something that I also established in the very beginning of the lesson when we were discussing our two poems and doing a compare and contrast, and including within that discussion of the compare and contrast a dedication poem and a poem in memorial. So as I continue to reflect on what I did in this lesson, I'm really, really pleased with the level of thought that the students put into the actual literacy lesson. I don't know exactly if their level of thinking was because of the personal nature of the poetry, or if it was more because of their innate interest in poetry. I think it was a combination of both. However, I also think that regardless of what kind of poetry we were doing, I think that the students would have naturally gravitated towards the discussion because they have a love for poetry, and I think you can really see that in this lesson. So I hope that you will visit the student reflection page. You can hear from a couple of the students who participated in the lesson, but I just wanted to share some thoughts about the lesson that I did with them.